Hello, thank you everybody for joining. This is obviously a very strange way of delivering these sessions. Normally we would obviously be looking to be round a table with many of you, though obviously with current challenges around COVID, and actually obviously the reason why we're seeing a lot of the challenges that we are experiencing currently have been coming through because of this. So as such, I am welcoming you from my living room, which is obviously not the usual environment, but it's obviously made it a very easy commute for me. So obviously what we're looking to talk about today is the changing world that we're seeing impacting the world of transport, and how some of those challenges and opportunities are going to become more available to you. So obviously I'm joined today by a number of esteemed guests. So we've got Paul McMahon, who's the Interim Managing Director for System Operators. We've got Dr. Mike Short, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for International Trade, and Matthew Hudson, who's the Head of Strategy, Technology and Data for Transport for London. So yeah, thank you all for coming. So what I'd like to do is kind of briefly hand over to each of you in turn to give a bit of a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do, and then we can kind of get stuck in with answering some of the big questions. So Paul, would you like to start off with us, please?
Thanks. Okay, good afternoon. So I'm Paul McMahon. I'm the Interim Managing Director for the System Operator at Network Rail, and the System Operator is a function that's responsible for, in essence, planning of the network. So we do network-wide rail planning, looking out 30 years or more, and we're also responsible from that all the way through to timetable planning. So planning and delivering the timetable that changes every week on the railway network.
Fantastic, thank you for that, Paul. And Mike, would you like to take on next?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to take part today. So I am the Chief Scientific Advisor within the Department for International Trade. I don't cover all of transport for the UK, but I do support international interests in transport. Before taking this on at the beginning of 2018, I had something like 40 years in electronics and telecommunications. One of my privileges was to launch GSM or 2G for Cellnet before it became O2. But for the last 2.5 years, it's been mainly involving activities to support British exporters and indeed inward investors internationally through DIT within the UK government.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Mike. And lastly, Matthew, over to you, please.
Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, a delight to be here this afternoon. So while I'm currently looking at TfL's overall strategy for both tech and data, its applications, its architecture, I've actually had a 20-year career in TfL that's covered all sorts of different angles, from line extensions, infrastructure contracts, property development, and even technical IP exploitation. So from a broad background, I hope to bring some insights from TfL. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you all so very much for joining us today. It's really appreciated for you that you've given us our time. Obviously, I'm sure the audience are going to be really excited to hear some of the things that we can talk about. So I think probably for me, first of all, what I'd really like to hear a little bit more about is, obviously, we've gone through a period of extreme and rapid change. Many of us have, for the first times in probably the last 20, 30 years, have moved no more than a mile away from our home for several months now. Obviously, that's now starting to change. The world is starting to open up a little bit more. So really looking to hear from each of you, what do you see happening over kind of the next 3 to 6 months as the world starts to get back towards a semblance of normal, and how will the transport networks need to adapt to allow that to happen? So should we start off with you first of all, Paul?
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, we've seen a dramatic fall in passenger numbers on the mainline rail network over the last 3 months. We normally carry about 5 million passengers each day on the network, and that collapsed to about 5% of its normal level. We hit that sort of level by mid-April. Since mid-April and into May and over the last month, we've recovered, seen recovery of those numbers to around about 15% of normal levels in aggregate terms across the network. Obviously, predominantly sort of people going back to work in cities, key workers, and so on, particularly on sort of construction activity and stuff like that. But it's clearly a way off what we're normally used to. We're anticipating, a further sort of incremental increases, which we've seen week on week, those carrying on in parallel with sort of further easing of government lockdown measures. One of the challenges we've got is applying social distancing on the railways, and actually, if you apply social distancing, the effective capacity of a train is in the region of 15 to 20%. So, at 2 meters, it's obviously higher if you apply 1 meter social distancing. So, one of our challenges, as well as seeing passengers come back onto the network, is being able to do that, giving them confidence and being able to transport them safely with appropriate social distancing and other measures.
Fantastic, thank you. So actually, probably as a quick follow up on that question to that, so what is it that you're doing to help enable organisations to deliver that kind of safe social distance space to ensure that you are both meeting the capacity requirements, but also that safety or the need to allow people that space?
Well, as Network Rail, we're the infrastructure manager, and my team, we produce the timetable. So when we went into lockdown, in fact, on that day, on the 23rd of March, we put in place emergency timetables. We reduced the number of train services running from about 24,000 to about 13,000 actually on that day. Since then, we've gone through various rounds of timetable change, and we're running about 17,000 passenger services today. We're making a further increase in services next Monday, and obviously one of the things we need to do is to provide sufficient capacity to carry the volumes we're anticipating under social distancing, and to work with the train operators to tune where and when we provide those services, where we're seeing changes in the pattern of demand, even though it's not yet back up to normal levels. And looking further ahead, there are questions about what level of provision do we provide for in the months ahead. And the train operators themselves. So I was going to say, sorry, the train operators themselves, of course, are working on how they manage on trains, providing guidance to passengers, and we're doing that at the major stations which we own and manage around. And people may well have seen that in terms of marking, providing an opportunity to buy a mask, sanitizer, and good passenger communications as well.
Fantastic. No, that's great. No, I guess that needs to work closely with the train operating companies to really ensure that what you do is aligned with each other to allow for your timetable to meet the needs of their passengers as well. So thanks for that, Paul. Probably maybe if we then move on to you, Matthew, given obviously TfL are both responsible for both the infrastructure and also the operation of some of those services, both on buses and the underground. How are you seeing that need to provide that additional capacity and distancing?
Yeah, thanks. I was just smiling because obviously at the moment I'm the integrated transport provider. Be interesting as we get onto it to see how the rail industry is going to grow and change after this, but that's for another question. What's interesting hearing Paul's stats is they almost perfectly align with what's happening in certainly the underground, although clearly timetabling is a slightly different issue for us. We're now up to 97.5% of normal tube services is being run. That's been steadily rising as, of course, we tackled the difficulty of making sure our staff were safe to begin with. And again, we're up to this sort of 10 to 15% capacity. I think two questions are asked in terms of, sort of things we've done. I think people know what they are. They've seen the sort of messaging, and it is interesting that it is back to sort of posters and announcements and bits of tape stuck on the floor to help guide people's behaviour and try to manage that situation. And I think in some respects we are all seeing how it goes as we go through this. And while passenger demand is low, we are able to manage the 2 metre or 1 metre distancing as we come. I think the real challenge is as we look forward, and I tend to think, well, what is going to happen if we continue to grow and grow in terms of demand for our services, but that rocks against our need to provide a safe environment for our customers. And I think that is an issue that we're all got to grapple with at some point. And I don't think it's an easy answer. I think particularly for us, looking forward to when office workers and educational establishments start returning in September is a long-term date looking forward, you say, for the next 6 months, which is interesting. I think the final point I would just add is, I'm sure like others, we, TfL, have been engaging with businesses in London. So, to try and help spread out demand as smoothly as possible. So particularly when we had retail opening, lots of engagement to try to get non-essential retail to open just a bit later and possibly to close a bit later to try and avoid putting more people onto the network at those peak hours. So that's where we are at the moment. And I think it's just interesting to see how this is going to evolve as we come out of lockdown. Going into lockdown was reasonably easy. It's this coming out which is causing us some anxieties and challenges.
Absolutely, I can really sympathise with that. In fact, although in a very different methodology, we've had to kind of grapple with this ourselves with the reopening of our retail estate, where obviously traditionally shops are used to having people come in and they'll queue and browse around, whereas we've actually had to deploy some new technology specifically to enable people to still have a good experience of the retail environment, but without introducing any additional danger to either our own people or our customers. So yeah, certainly what we've been doing is almost virtual queuing, so allowing people to book their slots, then wander off around the shops, and then they'll be notified when it's coming up for their time to come back in. And I certainly see the adoption of technology to help monitor and manage social distancing and manage that increase in users will become more and more important over time. As you say, with smaller numbers, it's probably not quite so problematic, but as you get back towards normal numbers, you obviously there's going to be real challenges there for you.
I think so, and I'm not. One of the things in all our world, relying on technology is difficult. In that, if there's assumptions that everyone has access to mobile phones and smart apps, etc., that certainly isn't the case, and that is why it is quite a challenge, because what are the techniques we can rely on to manage demand on a tube line? Do we limit people getting on at the gate line? Do the trains fill up by the fourth stop? All those challenges. It's clear to understand them. But of course, it's very much a difficult to get our mind around how to solve those challenges when we've spent the last 100 years trying to get as many people as possible onto trains. And I think that is it's a real challenge how operationally we work with data that we might have on how the network is operating, but how practically to manage the flow of people using our services in a safe and an equitable way.
Completely agree. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Matthew. And then lastly, Mike, over to you to get some feedback from what you're seeing is happening around the world, where obviously we've got other areas, particularly in kind of the Far East, where they have kind of more experience of reacting to pandemic outbreaks. And we certainly seem to see a much quicker recovery time coming from some of those areas than kind of more of the Western world, where this is something we haven't experienced for many, many years?
Well, let me start by saying I'm a member of SAGE, which has been advising the UK government on a lot of the science in this area. And whether you like it or not, science is here to stay. I think we know that this COVID outbreak is the worst probably for 100 years or more, so may even predate the birth of the railway at a push. What we can also see is that COVID-19 has exposed inequalities between people, between companies, and between countries. So we can see different approaches around the world addressing COVID-19. But what it also says is that public services are here to stay. And I think transport is one of the key ones that we acknowledge is going to be a vital part of recovery. Unless transport gets moving again, we're going to struggle with getting people to work, of course, but also getting the right freight to the right destinations and much more. So it's vital that we get transport moving again. Other countries that have been less badly hit with COVID-19 have certainly kept the transport moving with perhaps more social distancing measures, including usage of masks, including the usage of telecommunications to alert people to delays in transport or the arrival of trains, the arrival of buses. We can see a lot more use of data in some countries alongside the social distancing measures. We can also see that some of the safety measures might include advanced bookings to help with things like better planning of transport. We can see also how data is playing a much bigger part, not just in transport, but in all sectors. It was quite notable how in April, some of the internet-based data sources appeared in the ministerial briefings we had here in the UK. And some of those have been helpful as measures of the movement of people rather than necessarily the movement of goods or transport. However, I think the use of data is being seen more and more. Saw a recent piece in the New York Times that plotted mobile data for most of the movement of people across the USA, not with sufficient granularity for all transport, but certainly was a good indicator as to why some of the COVID-19 growth in cases is still growing in the USA, because they haven't really had the lockdown that we have. So when it comes to getting back to work, I think we do need to take lessons from our
We lost Mike there, or is that me that's gone? Okay, well, whilst we're waiting for Mike to come back, actually, I read that New York Times article, and it's really fascinating the way that they were able to kind of map down to the individual level how people, where kind of the pandemics were coming from, and how they could track it back to individuals and their travel movements all across the country. Was really, really fascinating. Sorry, one thing I didn't mention at the start is obviously we are looking to open up to questions slightly later on in the call. So if you do have any questions, obviously there is a question box for you to open up on screen. So please do feel free to ask questions in there, and we'll look to kind of put those out to you later on. So I guess whilst we're looking to see if we can get Mike back, maybe move on to another question there. So probably a really good one for you, Paul. Given the need for us to really start adapting and kind of building back up towards high volumes of passengers, how do you see that what's happened here is going to impact on the way that services are going to be able to be run, and how you're going to have to plan the timetable for kind of both the medium and the long term?
Well, if we're looking at the longer term, I mean, nobody knows how demand, what's the pattern of demand. But once we start coming out of this sort of initial recovery phase, and everyone's got a view, we'll all have an idea about whether businesses are going to look for staff to work at home, maybe travel to London or a big city once a week rather than 4 or 5 times a week. So we don't know. We're working with industry partners, the DFT, and others to do some scenario mapping. And it's vitally important that we understand what that looks like. I mean, we've got a huge capital investment program over this 5-year sort of regulatory period that we work in, to the tune of £10 billion. And the question is, well, are we prioritising the right investments in the face of what demand's going to look like in the future? So all we're doing at the minute is trying to understand customer views, customer opinions, perceptions, and to try and build a better understanding and a better picture of how demand is going to recover over the months ahead. In the nearer term, we're working with the operators to build back up the timetable to closer to the normal levels of around about 24,000 trains a day, and trying to maintain and doing two things in parallel with that. Firstly, maintaining high levels of train performance. We've understandably seen high levels of punctuality over the last 3 months as we've had fewer passengers and fewer trains. So how do we bank that going forwards? That's what people would expect. And secondly, how do we make changes to the provision of services, as I said earlier, to tune those better to where changing patterns might be. If the peak is smoothed out a little bit, or we're seeing movements in peak travel patterns into London and other cities.
And possibly related to it, obviously, as a part of this and the reduction in the volume of transport we've got going through, obviously, one of the probably big well-documented positives that we've seen come out from this is obviously emissions have been vastly reduced over the last several months, making the world, certainly helping us towards getting back towards a position of balance with the world. How do we, or are we seeing as part of the recovery plans, we are just looking to get back in however we can, or are people taking the opportunity to look at how we can kind of use more sustainable methods to kind of get us back to that path of when at full capacity? Is it going to be where we were previously, or are we already looking at how we can improve that at the same time?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, we've all seen or read or heard, colleagues or friends or families say that they don't have trust in public transport at the moment. They're worried, they're a bit fearful, so they're going to resort to car use or cycling, and obviously different impacts on environmental considerations there. I mean, we're still planning on the basis that there's been a long run over the last 25 years, a significant growth in rail use, and we're still planning on the basis that over the long term that demand will increase. There will be modal shift away from the car, and hence the planning we're doing around electrification for the rail network over time. And of course, in the nearer term, there are government priorities for sort of levelling up the economy and building new or connecting new railway lines in parts of England and Wales that were shut down over the last few years.
That's great to hear, because obviously, kind of the more of these railway lines that do start reopening, that obviously the more options people are going to have over time to be able to start making kind of greener choices for transport. So I think we should now have Mike back. So welcome back, Mike. I'm going to desperately hope that's not because you're using an O2 router anywhere.
I was going to reassure you it was not.
Thank goodness for that. So I'll pass on to you probably next for that one, Matthew. So actually, in the same, obviously, kind of the mayor's strategy's got a real focus on moving more towards people walking and cycling more. How is that impacting on TfL's kind of plans for kind of the short, medium term? And actually, is this something that is being accelerated? And how are you managing the adoption of that if it is during this time?
So there's a few things I want to just throw out here, because hearing one of your points earlier, John, you said that it's cleaner air because we're now having less pollution, but let's be honest, that wasn't a conscious decision to try and reduce pollution in the world. It was a consequence of trying to save people from getting ill. So that issue of air quality and pollution still remains. I think it's fascinating to hear people make comments about, gosh, I can feel the air is cleaner, and maybe there is a stronger desire in the populace to make changes. Or then again, are we all going to be worried about just employment rights and the economy tanking and sustainability gets thrown out the window? So it's a really difficult space. And I think the other thing that you were commenting on about was, returning to high volumes. And I think, I'm sure maybe myself and probably Paul for Network Rail, if in 12 months we get back to where we were, that's great. And we roll out all our plans and we're trying to increase capacity and everything else. It might take a bit longer to get there. That's a bit more of a problem because, we both need subsidy to keep going during that period. But the real concern that we have to have is what happens if everyone is so concerned about their health because of continuing mini peaks or whatever over the next 3 years, and demand gets to 50% for me, and that's it. Then the question comes, okay, how do I run a sustainable railway? There's no money to pay for it. Is the government or taxation prepared to subsidize that? As we go and ratchet up debt, we get an even worse position. There are some really quite difficult things that could come to us going forward. And I think certainly in our perspective, we try and think of the different scenarios. Again, I'm not sure how much there is we can do about it because, back to Paul's point, we've got to wait and see. And I do hope that certainly from London, we've seen the growth of the city over 2,000 years. So one may sit here and think it's going to be okay because cities are the engine of economic growth and always have been and always will be. Or again, this could be the case where things change. And I'm not sure there's much we can do in that space other than wait and see. But if I do just come back to your point around sustainability, Mayor's transport strategy, trying to get 80% of people doing sustainable journeys. Currently it's at 63%, it was before COVID-19. And the thing that I've been really impressed with, and I hope I'm allowed to say this, I've been a bit surprised, actually, we managed to pull this off. But not only TfL, but London boroughs were very quick in acting to reallocate road space. So in effect, temporary cycle lanes appearing, that was a big change. And as we know in cities, the politics is how to allocate the space between the buildings. And the idea of throwing up as quickly as possible temporary cycle lanes, in effect, to see if they work, see if they can embed and move forward, has been, I know some from my organisation, but it's been really great to see that happen. And it has happened in other cities around the UK. So there's been some really positive action. I think the real challenge, as we say, is how will that bed in as we move forward? And will people continue to use bicycles? Will people continue to shun journeys? Or will we all have short memories and get back to it, or even worse, just get back in cars? That's certainly a concern from my side. And I think it is an evolving picture. And we'll be interested to see what policy tools we end up being able to use in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is such a fascinating area to kind of see how we're going to be able to do it, because we've certainly, from kind of what we see of people moving around, cycle journeys and walking journeys have obviously increased dramatically over the last few months compared to previously. So it's that can that remain as a sustainable way of doing things and allow for cities to function effectively. Mike, so yeah, I don't know if you caught the questions that we were talking about as you were kind of going through that restart, but it was a clear more talking about the focus on how the kind of different modes of transport and obviously we've seen a significant improvement in air quality over the last few months, and how we can ensure that as we return back to high levels of passenger movement and freight movement, that we can retain those better environmental kind of qualities that we're seeing.
Well, I think we need to retain them, but I think it's not just the responsibility of the transport industry to do it. I think it's the responsibility of everybody. I think the UK hosting the COP26 talks in Glasgow, or plan to be in Glasgow next year, will mean that every sector will be asked to put forward their green plans to suggest how we can reduce both emissions and the use of fossil fuels. I think even the transport sector itself needs to be preparing thoughts, whether it be from an airline, a buses, or a railway point of view. I think the subsectors need to come together with their plans that they have in the pipeline, but use COP26 as a way of sharing that. I think some of the emissions data is already being looked at more closely now than ever because of the impact of COVID-19 measures, and people won't want to go back to the higher levels. So I think that will impact things like airport planning and some of those areas associated with that as well. I think some of the issues to do with freight also need to be taken into account, because as the growth in e-commerce has also been notable, last mile deliveries become very important in this area. So I think we want to see the green dividend being maintained and improved upon, even if e-commerce and local last mile delivery does grow. I think we also need to look at other countries to see what they're doing, to see if we can learn lessons from other countries. But actually, the cities are going to be a key part of the economic recovery for the UK. And I think it's likely to be a green recovery, where the emphasis is put much more on government investing and matched funding into green recovery methods, whether it's to do with rail or road or the airlines. I've certainly had some international discussions with the airline industry about some of their plans to move towards biofuels and electric aircraft. It won't happen overnight, but it needs to be part of the strategy. And it was interesting that the UK government released the R&D roadmap this week, geared towards the uplift in R&D expenditure. So I think there'll be more room for experimentation in that R&D roadmap to help with the green growth agenda. Happy to say more if you wish.
No, that's really encouraging to see, and actually, it would be. We're certainly seeing a lot more of enterprises are really starting to take far more seriously than they have in the past that commitment to ecological recovery, not just economic recovery, and doing so sustainably. I know recently we've also brought forward our own commitment to carbon neutrality, from originally being at 2030, bringing that forward to 2025. And certainly it's good to see an awful lot of other organisations are coming up with far more aggressive plans than they'd ever seen previously, because actually we as employees and we as the public are demanding far more of ourselves than ever has been the case, which is fantastic to see. Certainly as an early adopter of more sustainable transport methods, this is something that it's great to see that I'm now having to fight for charging spaces. I'm really quite pleased to see this at times. Great. So I think before we open up to kind of the questions from the general public, I'm going to throw out one final question to you all, which is, what is the question that you're most tired of hearing on this subject? What would you like to say about it, and just so that you will never have to hear it again? So should we start with you this time, Matthew?
Oh, what do I say in this space? I think I might change the answer that I rehearsed. So the point I want to make is around funding of transport. I'm not sure it's a question, but it's the debate that's happening in that space. So for those who don't know, TfL no longer receives government grant. Has been working to try and become, certainly for its operating expenditures, just reliant on its fares and other income. That model was clearly completely tested in COVID-19. And as many other businesses, we have had to go to central government to seek support. And we have a deal. It was struck on the day we were going to have to enter into Section 114, which is public sector insolvency type things. And we have a deal, and we're now negotiating a new deal. And I know that the mayor, I think at this moment, is in front of a parliamentary committee discussing this. But we need to have a real debate about how we're doing the funding for transport and how that's moving forward. I think that's also going to happen in the rail industry. I think there's lots of discussions about the bus industry as well, how that's reacting, and what will happen to bus services not in major cities but in smaller towns and in local areas, in rural areas. There's some really difficult, thorny issues that need to be addressed in this space. So I don't think it's necessarily a sort of a flippant question, but it's certainly not an easy one of how do we come back and sort out the funding, certainly of the public transport in the UK.
Really great one, and one that I think has been a thorn in government side for quite some time as to what is the right balance to kind of deliver there. Brilliant, thank you for that one. So, oh, sorry, yeah, carry on.
No, please carry on.
Great. Next up, should we get you, Paul?
Well, the question I've had a lot, and I alluded to it in my previous answer, is what's demand going to look like in a year, 2, 5 years time as we recover from the crisis? And as I said, then nobody knows the answer to that. Yeah, we can look at experiences from other sort of global shocks, global issues, whether it's the financial crash in 2008, but there isn't really a precedent for this, and we just don't know at the moment. It's an interesting question. As I said, it's one we're looking hard at, and just really to sort of build on the points that Matthew made about the kind of the importance of that and the financial importance of that. It's not just an academic question. It's that fare income to the mainline railway and a sort of associated income for car parks and coffees and sandwiches and so on is about £11.5 billion a year. And I said the demand collapsed by 95% from the end of March into April. So we lost about 95% of around about 900 million or so each month. And that's obviously recovered now to 15% of that, but you can quickly do the maths and realise the funding and financial hole that the industry is in, and the taxpayer is also in because of this. So there are some serious questions that need to be answered about what exactly is the level of demand that we're going to recover to, and what does that mean for providing and funding the railway.
Yeah, really interesting, because I suppose obviously when you look at kind of the fairly slim margins that so many operators have to work at to be able to compete to win those franchises, actually it doesn't allow them the comfort of building up significant war chests to be able to weather such significant losses for such a sustained period of time.
No, exactly, which is why the government brought back the franchises into direct control under the emergency measures agreements at the start of the crisis, because it just wasn't sustainable for the train operating sector to carry that level of financial impact.
Absolutely. No, great. Thanks for that, Paul. And then lastly, just over to you, Mike, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions.
Just very briefly, I think the term "a new normal" needs to be banned. Because I don't think it's singular. There'll be different variations of normal. Secondly, I think we're going through a transformation as a result of technology and societal change. And thirdly, I think some of the issues really have brought technology forward very rapidly in the crisis, and I think we'll just maintain the use of them. So the term "a new normal" doesn't sound quite right to me. So I think there's a good case to ban it, but put in place more of a transformation program, and a transformation program that's sustainable. To Matthew's point about funding, that comes into that, but also something which is demand-led and can cope with the different uplifts and downlifts of demand that may occur across the different modes. Transformation is my preferred phrase.
Great. No, I appreciate that. And actually, there was a term Katie used, so my boss used recently that I quite liked, which is actually we were going through business as unusual rather than new business as usual. So I quite like that, because it acknowledged that this wasn't it wasn't even a new normal, it was just different. So I quite like that. So thank you all very much for that. So I'm going to open up some of the questions that I've received from the floor now, and actually a few of these I can probably bundle together, but I'm delighted to see the first one, because it's obviously a topic that's very dear to my heart, which is from Ben. It's, how do you view the impact of 5G on travel in a post-COVID-19 world? So let's start with you on that, Mike.
I think communications is going to affect lots of travel, both in terms of informing passengers about options, alerting them to difficulties, perhaps for the railway network and maybe the bus network, better planning information. I don't think it's 5G only, though. I think it's about the range of telecommunications technologies and the range of data solutions that are emerging. I think the use of better data stores, data exchanges, data mapping, even areas to do with cashless payments and paperless audit trails. To me, there's a lot of things technology can do. 5G is just the poster child at the moment, but there are many within the toolkit to be used today.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Paul, would you like to take it next?
Well, you're sort of testing my my expertise in areas of technology. I mean, clearly, as we've been hit by the crisis, things like ticketless travel, getting rid of moving to smart cards, getting rid of paper tickets. That's a big issue, and I certainly hope that we accelerate that. It seemed to be a long-running debate in the rail industry, moving forward on that, and sort of, and by contrast to what TfL have done over the last good few years. So hopefully 5G will help drive that as much as the crisis has done. A big issue in the rail industry is providing customer information, providing that on time, at speed. In all circumstances, customers are crying out for that, particularly when there's disruption on the network. So that's been a growing issue over the last few years, and it's here to stay, and we need to do more on that.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And actually, that probably kind of ties in nicely with the question that's come in from Danny G, which is, will TfL work more closely with the train operated companies to ensure cross-mode ticketless travel will increase confidence in current current train customer can only travel to London with a kind of mag strip ticket? Sorry, that was to Matthew.
Yeah, I've been in ticketing for 10 years as well, and this is a long and sorry tale of history which isn't worth going over. The point is, and I think Paul made it there, is how can we learn going forward? And maybe I just want to combine that with something that Mike said as well. Technology isn't the real driver here. What are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to deliver? And I would just warn slightly against the desire for everything becoming seamless and integrated and everything in one place. That's one of my, I'm not a big fan of mobility as a service, as an answer to all these problems. What we have to do is to create better customer experiences that are easy to understand and easy to operate for customers and make sense. So trying to jump to fully integrated ticketing everywhere is not going to happen straight away. I think the rail industry's got a few things to address in terms of, it's got paper tickets. That is something we have to look to get rid of. I know we've talked about that, because that will help us in our costs and it will help us get better relationships with our customers. We have these digital traces. And then we need to build off of that for better customer experiences about how we interact with our customers. So again, the ability to use your phone and your apps is important, particularly as we're going to do it actually on the underground. But we've got to really focus on that customer experience. And so let's see that with COVID-19 coming in and changing the landscape, I think we're more open to transformation innovation. Again, as Mike said, quite frankly, I'm also quite pleased with what's happening with the DfT taking over the franchises, because one of the things that always used to suffer when we looked at trying to do innovation in the rail industry is the fact that different people were in different places according to their franchise. And if you have 2 years to go on your franchise, you're in a different place if you have 8 years to run your franchise. And I'm not blaming various companies, but they were in different commercial positions, in terms of how they made returns to their shareholders. And so I think with the new change, we may be able to better align and deliver some of these changes to the customer experience, in the realms of ticketing.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So here's one that seems to be a theme that's come through a number of times. So I'll consolidate these down into one. So the word on the street is that commuters will not be returning to cities in the same large numbers that we've seen in the past. We're going to see a lot more permanent working from home. Actually, how do we believe that should or will impact onto capital investment priorities? And are we going to have to make changes? Do we carry on with things like HS2, third runways at Heathrow, Crossrail, etc.? So should we start with you on that one, Matthew?
So I'll let me do the Crossrail one first. And I know I've got a stake in this one, but I'm telling you, given how far it's got, we're delivering Crossrail, okay? We're not going to stop that now. There's far too much to be done on it. But I think that, the question is a good one. And it goes a bit back to what I say earlier. And I'll pause on this. We don't know what the future is going to be like. So one scenario is, yes, maybe the 9 to 5 commuting changes, more people working from home. There's more capacity on the peak in our transport network, but that gets taken up by other people who want to make other journeys. And suddenly, I take London and it becomes, 10 times as productive because 10 times as many companies can now work there because most of their staff are 90% of the time not in London. So, that's a positive outlook. The negative outlook is actually demand is suppressed for the long term. And absolutely, we start thinking, well, actually, if this demand isn't going to pick up, some of our investment decisions that were made need to be rethought. I think the only thing that's positive is, in our industry, it takes a long time to make infrastructure decisions. So I suspect that we will certainly have a better view in about 6 to 9 months to better tackle that. And we'll have a view of whether we're getting back to normal, as in terms of normal levels of travel, or whether it's going to be below that. So I think in time we'll have a better view, but they are legitimate questions to ask. And as I said, given the scarcity of capital and investment that will be around in the future, it's questions we're going to have to ask ourselves.
Great, thank you for that. Paul, do you want to take a view on that as well, please?
Yeah, well, we've touched on a few of those points. I mean, we've, as I said, we're looking at our capital program, working with colleagues in the DfT. We've got a lot of money and a lot of schemes lined up for the next few years. As I said earlier, there's a strong rate of growth that has been predicted over the next few years. So our current working assumption is that even if there's a decline now and a slower recovery over time, we'll still need capacity coming into cities and other places across the country. But it's a good question. It's the right question to ask. I think Matthew made a good point that we wouldn't want to get caught out in 10 or 20 years time by our success, by people who follow us and sort of curse us for not having made the right investments, and we get caught out then. So we're going to have some tough conversations, do some hard analysis over the next few months to get those future plans right.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a kind of follow-up on question on that for you, Mike, is now that we're starting to see airports starting to reopen and countries starting to, if not open their borders, certainly have safe routes that are being agreed, how do we see the need to differentiate between passengers that we're going to see coming in from overseas and then using the transport networks compared to those that are using them locally, or is there a need to differentiate and take that into account?
I think there is some need to differentiate, but let me just go back to the previous question a bit. I think demand should be a key part of it from a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term point of view. I think the analysis needs to obviously take a view of the long-term as well as the short-term. I think there are some issues about the balance of modes, which I think needs to be taken into account. But I think the last thing to do with the COVID crisis that's not yet over is to overreact to the short-term of the COVID crisis that we've just had. I think it does need long-term planning in the mix, even if there are some shorter or medium-term things we can do. I think for airports, I think I'm more concerned about the freight issues, because economic recovery does depend on international freight coming in and going out. It also depends on it being locally delivered. So I'm more concerned about the freight rather than necessarily any air bridge issues or quarantine issues. I think the quarantine issues will probably be lifted pretty soon, whether it's for incoming tourists or for outgoing tourists and business travelers. I think also some of our need for transport therefore needs to be looked at holistically to make sure that we're not inhibiting things. I do think in the next 2 to 3 months, there'll be more calls for innovation and experimentation. I think that needs to sit alongside the analysis and the longer term planning. But I think actually I would plead for calm, measured calm, and putting money where it's needed to either experiment or analyze or plan.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Mike. So I'm kind of conscious that we are running out of time. So I know we've still got quite a few questions to go through. So what I'll do is we'll make sure that those questions that haven't been answered, we'll look to kind of come back to each of you individually. But as a final question for each of you, and I love this question that's coming from Simon, is how can we take this opportunity to level up? Given that that's obviously a strapline that we're seeing coming into government, how do we take this as that opportunity? So, Paul, would you like to take that one first?
Well, I think we are taking that opportunity already. We've been, even prior to the crisis and under the sort of banner of levelling up, we've been working with the government since last year on planning and starting to deliver some schemes across the country, which fit the levelling up agenda. So, sort of beaching reopenings are sort of top of that list, but not exclusive to that.
Fabulous, thank you. Matthew, would you like to take that next?
Yeah, so my observation here is we have to be bold as a country, because at the moment, I think everyone is up for change or for trying things, and I think we have to take advantage of that. So, my sort of plea would be to the politicians of all colours, whether they be the mayor or the central government, to work these plans through and be bold and try and achieve, a sustainable outcome. Yes, levelling up across the country. We still have issues of diversity and inclusion, which have come to the fore during this time on a completely different matter. There are all these difficult societal challenges which we can make progress because we are in a state that's ready to accept change and trying new things.
Fantastic, great answer there, thank you. And Mike?
I'd like to point to an example of being bold. I think the announcement of the R&D roadmap this week, which is open to consultation, is to support $22 billion in research and development by 2024. That's right, I said dollars, I mean pounds. And as a consultation document, it's a useful read. It certainly addresses the levelling up story within the R&D side. So I think the time for experimentation is now. I don't think it's about changing what we've got. I think it's transforming things that we have and doing things better. But if we want to do some more things with clean growth, if we want to do some more things with new transport modes like future flight, then I think there is more money being made available, and people should look at that R&D roadmap and say, what instruments are in there to help me do what I want to do in this transformed world post-COVID.
Fantastic, thank you for that, Mike. And for me, certainly the where I see there being such an opportunity here, and we've certainly seen it starting over the last probably decade or so, where we've seen far more innovative uses of technology to allow us to use those infrastructures we already had far more effectively. So, Matthew, please do forgive me as I talk about this, but things like Uber, the way that they revolutionised the expectations around we could use a humble taxi. It's completely transformed and digitized that experience and created a whole raft of separate industries that have come off the back of that, from your Deliveroos and all these sorts of things, where they really adopted technology to transform existing services that we already all knew and used, but just made them so much more significantly accessible and kind of make them something that we're all far more keen to utilize. So it's what I'd really love to be able to see is see this sort of innovation, but make sure that we see that innovation being used in a sustainable way that will make the UK kind of the fantastic country that it already is. So really want to thank all of you so much for your time today. You have all been absolutely fascinating. This has been a really great experience for me. So I really, really enjoyed that. So thank you each and every one of you. And also, obviously, thank you to our audience. Obviously, I've got a whole raft of questions, so we'll look to kind of share those out. So thank you very much. And if you, hopefully you'll all join me in giving our panel here a round of applause. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Take care. Bye-bye.